Hello. Guess what? I'm gonna read this to you. So this is The Thief, a great book, and I'm reading it to my dear friend Rissa, who I love, but who prefers audiobooks, and is therefore going to get one, gosh darn it, because she needs to read this book. Okay. This is part 1 of I don't know how many, but we'll record for 30 minutes and see how far we get. The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. Chapter 1. I didn't know how long I had been in the king's prison. The days were all the same, except that as each one passed I was dirtier than before. Every morning the light in the cell changed from the wavering orange of the lamp in the sconce outside my door to the dim but even glow of the sun falling into the prison's central courtyard. In the evening, as the sunlight faded, I reassured myself that I was one day closer to getting out. To pass time, I concentrated on pleasant memories, laying them out in order, and examining them carefully. I reviewed over and over the plans that had seemed so straightforward before I arrived in jail, and I swore to myself and every god I knew that if I got out alive, I would never, ever, never take any risks that were so abysmally stupid again. I was thinner than I had been when I was first arrested. The large iron ring around my waist had grown loose, but not loose enough to fit over the bones of my hips. Few prisoners wore chains in their cells, but only those that the king particularly disliked. Counts, or dukes, or the minister of the exchequer when he told the king there wasn't any more money to spend. I was certainly none of those things, but I suppose it's safe to say that the king disliked me. Even if he didn't remember my name, or whether I was common as dirt, he didn't want me slipping away. So I had chains on my ankles, as well as the iron belt around my waist, and an entirely useless set of chains locked around my wrists. At first I pulled the cuffs off my wrists, but since I sometimes had to force them back on quickly, my wrists started to be rubbed raw. After a while, it was less painful just to leave the manacles on. To take my mind off my daydreams, I practiced moving around the cell without clanking. I had enough chain to allow me to pace in an arc from a front corner of the cell out to the center of the room and back to the rear corner. My bed was there at the back, a bench made of stone with a thin bag of sawdust on top. Beside it was the chamber pot. There was nothing else in the cell except myself and the chain and, twice a day, food. The cell door was a gate of bars. The guards looked in at me as they passed on their rounds, a tribute to my reputation. As part of my plans for greatness, I'd bragged without shame about my skills in every wine store in the city. I'd wanted everyone to know that I was the finest thief since mortal men were made, and I must have come close to accomplishing the goal. Huge crowds gathered for my trial. Most of the guards in the prison had turned out to see me after my arrest, and I was endlessly chained to my bed when other prisoners were sometimes allowed the freedom of sunshine of the prison's courtyard. There was one guard who always seemed to catch me with my head in my hands, and he always laughed. "What?" he would say. "Haven't you escaped yet?" Every time he laughed, I spat insults at him. It was not politic, but as always, I couldn't keep an insult in when it wanted to come out. Whatever I said, the guard laughed more. I ached with cold. It had been early in the spring when I'd been arrested and dragged out of the Shade Oak wine shop. Outside the prison walls, the summer's heat must have dried out the city and driven everyone indoors for afternoon naps, but the prison cells got no direct sun, and they were as damp and cold as when I had first arrived. I spent hours dreaming of the sunshine, the way it soaked into the city walls and made the yellow stones hot to lean on hours after the day had ended, the way it dried out water spills and the rare libations to the gods still occasionally poured into the dust outside the wine shops. Sometimes I moved as far as my chains would let me and looked through the bars of my cell door and across the deep gallery that shaded the prison cells at the sunlight falling into the courtyard. The prison was 2 stories of cells stacked one on top of another. I was in the upper level. Each cell opened onto the gallery, and the gallery was separated from the courtyard by stone pillars. There were no windows in the outside walls, which were 3 or 4 feet thick, built of massive stones that 10 men together couldn't have shifted. Legends said that the old gods had stacked them together in a day. The prison was visible from almost anywhere in the city because the city was built on a hill, and the prison was at the summit. The only other building there was the king's home, his megaron. There had also been a temple to the old gods once, but it had been destroyed, and the basilica to the new gods was built further down on the hill. Once the king's home had been a true megaron, one room, with a throne and a hearth, and the prison had been the agora, where citizens met and merchants hawked their jumble. I want to apologize at this time for my heating. It's so loud. Anyway. The individual cells had been stalls of clothes or wine or candles or jewelry imported from the islands. Prominent citizens used to stand on the stone blocks in the courtyard to make speeches. Then the invaders had come with their longboats and their own ideas of commerce. They did their trading in open markets next to their ships. They had taken over the King's Megaron for their governor and used the solid stone building of the Agora as a prison. Prominent citizens ended up chained to the blocks instead of standing on them. The old invaders were pushed out by new invaders, and in time Sunis revolted and had their own king again. Still, people did their trading down by the waterfront. It had become habit, and the new king continued to use the Agora as a prison. It was useful to him, as he was no relation to any of the families that had ruled the city in the past. By the time I ended up here, most people in the city had forgotten the prison was ever anything but a holding pen for those who failed to pay their taxes, none other criminals. I was lying on my back in my cell with my feet in the air, wrapped in the chain that led from my waist to a ring high in the wall. It was late at night. The sun had been gone for hours, and the prison was lit by burning lamps. I was weighing the merits of clean clothes versus better food, and not paying attention to that tramp of feet outside my cell. There was an iron door that led from the prison into a guard room at the narrow end of the building. The guards passed through it many times a day. If I heard the door banging, I no longer took any notice of it, so I was unprepared when lamplight, concentrated by a lens, flared into my cell. I wanted to look lithe and graceful and perhaps feral as I unwrapped my feet and sat up. Caught by surprise and nearly blind, I was clumsy and would have fallen off the stone bunk if the chain had not still been wrapped around one foot. I forgot this bit. I love this book. Yeah. Well, this is the right one. No wonder the voice sounded surprised. I levered myself upright and blinked into the lamplight, unable to see much. The guard reassured someone that this was indeed the prisoner he wanted. All right, take him out. The guard said, "Yes, Magus," as he unlocked the barred gate, so I knew who it was at my door late at night. One of the king's most powerful advisors. In the days before the invaders came, the king's magus was supposed to have been a sorcerer, but not even the most superstitious believed that anymore. A magus was a scholar. He read scrolls and books in every language and studied everything that had ever been written, and things that had never been written as well. If the king needed to know how many shafts of grain grew on a particular acre of land, the magus could tell him. If the king wanted to know how many farmers would starve if he burned that acre of grain, the magus knew that too. His knowledge, matched by his skills of persuasion, gave him the power to influence the king, and that made him a powerful figure at the court. He'd been at my trial. I'd seen him sitting in a gallery behind the judges with one leg crossed over the other, and his arms folded over his chest. Once I'd disentangled myself from the chains, the guards unlocked the rings on my feet, using a key as big as my thumb. They left the manacles on my wrist, but released the chain that attached them to the waist ring. Then they hauled me to my feet and out of the cell. The maid just looked up and down and wrinkled his nose, probably at the smell. He wanted to know my name. I said, "Jen." He wasn't interested in the rest. "Bring him along," he said, as he turned his back on me and walked away. All of my own impulses to balance and move seemed to conflict with those of the guards, and I was jerked and jostled down the portico, just as graceful as a sick cat. We crossed through the guard room to a door that led to the outer wall of the prison, to a flight of stone steps and a courtyard that lay between the prison and the south wing of the King's Megaron. The Megaron's walls rose 4 stories over our heads on 3 sides. The king's tiny stronghold had become a palace under the supervision of the invaders, and an even larger palace since then. We crossed the courtyard, followed by a guard carrying a lantern, to a shorter flight of steps that led up to a door in the wall of the Megaron. On the other side of the door, the white walls of a passageway reflected the light of so many lamps that it seemed as bright as day inside. I threw my head sideways and dragged one arm away from a guard in order to cover my eyes. The light felt solid, like spears that went through my head. Both guards stopped, and one tried to grab my arm back, but I dragged it away again. The maid just stopped to see what the noise was. "Give him a moment to let his eyes adjust," he said. It was going to take longer, but the minute helped. I blinked some of the tears out of my eyes, and we started down the passageway again. I kept my head down, and my eyes nearly closed, and didn't see much of the passageways at first. They had marble floors. The baseboards were painted with an occasional patch of lilies and a tortoise or a resting bird. We went up a staircase where a painted pack of hunting dogs chased a lion around a corner, to a door, where we stopped. The maid just knocked and went in. The guards, with some difficulty, navigated themselves and me through the narrow doorway. I looked around to see who had watched my clumsy entrance, but the room was empty. I was excited. My blood rushed around like wine sloshing in a jar, but I was also deadly tired. The walk up the stairs had felt like a hike up the mountain. My knees wobbled, and I was glad to have the guards, graceless as they were, holding me at the elbows. When they let go, I was off balance and had to swing my arms to keep from falling. My chains clanked. "You can go," said the magus to the guards. "Come take him back in half an hour." Half an hour? My hopes, which had been rising, fell a little. As the guards left, I looked around the room. It was small, with a desk and several comfortable chairs scattered around it. The Magus stood next to the desk. The windows behind him should have looked out on the Megaron's greater courtyard, but the tiny panes of glass only reflected the light of lamps burning inside. I looked again at the chairs. I picked the nicest one and sat in it. The Magus stiffened. His eyebrows snapped down into a single line across the top of his face. They were dark, though most of his hair had gone gray. "Get up," he commanded. I leaned farther into the feather pillow on the seat and back out of the chair. It was almost as good as clean clothes, and I couldn't have gotten up if I had tried. My knees were weak, and my stomach was considering tossing up the little I had recently eaten. The chair back came to just behind my ears, so I rested my head back and looked up my nose at the Magus, still standing at his desk. The Magus gave me a few minutes to consider my position before he stepped over to the chair. He leaned down until his nose was just a few inches from mine. I hadn't seen his face before from this close. He had the high-bridged nose of most people in the city, but his eyes were very light gray instead of brown. His forehead was covered by wrinkles brought on by a lot of sun and too much frowning. I was thinking that he must have done some sort of outdoor work before he started reading books when he spoke. I stopped thinking about his complexion and shifted my gaze back to his eyes. "We might someday attain a relationship of mutual respect," he said softly. "First," I thought, "I will see the gods walking the earth." He went on, "But now I will have your obedience." His ability to convey a world of threat in so few words was remarkable. I swallowed, and my hands shook a little where they lay on the arms of the chair. One link of the chain clinked against the other, but I still didn't try to get up. My legs wouldn't have lifted me. He must have realized this, and also known that he had made his point, because he stepped back to lean against the desk, and waved one hand in disgust. "Never mind. Stay there for now. The seat will have to be cleaned." I felt my face getting redder. It wasn't my fault that I stank. He should spend some months in the king's prison, and then we'd see if he still smelled like old books and scented soap. He looked me over for several moments more, and didn't seem impressed. "I saw you at your trial," he said, finally. I didn't say that I'd noticed him there as well. "You're thinner." I shrugged. "Tell me," said the Magus, "have you found yourself reluctant to leave our hospitality? You said at your trial that not even the king's prison could hold you, and I rather expected you to be gone by now." He was enjoying himself. I crossed my legs and settled deeper into the chair. He winced. I said, "Some things take time." "How true," said the Magus. "How much time do you think it's going to take?" Another half hour, I thought, but I didn't say that either. "I think it's going to take a long time," said the Magus. "I think it could take the rest of your life. After all," he joked, "when you're dead, you certainly won't be in the king's prison, will you?" "I suppose not." I didn't think it was funny. "You boasted about a lot of things at your trial. Idle boasts, I suppose." "I can steal anything." "So you claimed. It was a wager to that effect that landed you in prison." He picked a pen nib off the desk beside him and turned it in his hands for a moment. "It is too bad for you that intelligence does not always attend gifts such as yours, and fortunate for me that it is not your intelligence I am interested in, but your skill. If you are as good as they say you are." I repeated myself. "I can steal anything." "Except yourself, out of the king's prison?" the Magus asked, lifting only one eyebrow this time. I shrugged. I could do that too, but it would take time. It might take a long time, and I wanted the king's Magus to offer a faster way. "Well, you've learned how to keep your mouth shut, at least," said the Magus. He pulled himself away from his desk and walked across the room. While his back was turned, I pushed the hair from my eyes and took another quick look around the room. It was his study, but I already knew that. There were books and old scrolls in piles on the shelves. There was a scarred bench piled with amphoras and other clay containers. There were glass bottles as well. At the end of the room was a curtained alcove, barely visible under the curtain was a pair of feet in leather boots. I turned back around in my chair with my stomach jumping. "You could shorten the time without shortening your life," said the Magus. I looked up at him. I had lost the thread of conversation. In the moment it took me to recover it, I realized that he was now nervous himself. I relaxed in my seat. "Well, go on." "I want you to steal something." I smiled. "Do you want the king's seal? I can get it for you." "If I were you," said the Magus, "I'd stop bragging about that." His voice grated. My smile grew. The gold ring with the engraved ruby had been in his safekeeping when I'd stolen it away. Losing it, I was sure, had badly damaged his standing at the king's court. He glanced over my shoulder at the curtained alcove, and then he got to the point. "There's something I want you to steal. Do this for me, and I'll see that you don't go back to prison. Fail to do this for me, and I will still make sure that you don't go back to prison. Prisoners left the king prison all the time. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, any skilled craftsman could expect to finish their sentences working for the king's profit. Unskilled workers were collected several times a year and sent to the silver mines south of the city. They rarely returned, and other prisoners just disappeared. It was clear enough what the mages had in mind, so I nodded. What am I stealing? That was all I cared about. The mages dismissed the question. You can find out the details later. What I need to know now is that you're capable, that I hadn't been overcome by disease, crippled, or starved beyond usefulness while in prison. I'm capable, I said, but I have to know what I'm stealing. You'll be told. For now it isn't your business. What if I can't steal it? I thought that you could steal anything, he taunted. Except myself out of king's prison, I agreed. Don't try to be smart. The mage shook his head. You don't pretend well. Oh, that's a bird. I forgot about that too. I'm sorry. I opened my mouth to say something I shouldn't have, but he went on. It will require some traveling to reach my object. There will be plenty of time for you to learn about it as we go. I sat back in my chair, mollified and delighted. If I got out of the city of Sunis, no one would bring me back. The mage just had to have known exactly what I was thinking, because he leaned close over me again. Don't think that I am a fool. He wasn't a fool. That much was true. But he didn't have my motivation. He leaned back against the desk, and I sat back in my chair, thinking that the gods had listened to my prayers at last. Then I heard the rings on the top of the curtain behind me slide across their rod, and I remembered the 2 feet in the alcove. My stomach, which had settled a little, began to jump again. The boots stamped across the room, and a hand came over the back of the chair in order to grab me by the hair. The owner of the hand lifted me up as he walked to the front of the chair and held me facing him. Don't think I am a fool either, he said. He was short, just as his father had been, and stocky. His hair was dark gold color and curled around his ears. It would have looked effeminate on anyone else. It probably endeared him to his mother when he was a child, but there was nothing endearing about him now. My hair was pulling free of my head, and I was standing on the tips of my toes to relieve the strain. I put both hands on top of his, tried to push the hand down, and found myself hanging entirely off the ground. He dropped me. My legs folded under me, and I sat on the floor with a thump that jarred my entire body. I rubbed my head, trying to push the hair back into my scalp. When I looked up, the king was wiping his hand on the front of his clothes. Get up, he said. I did, still rubbing my head. The king of Sunis was not polished, nor was he an impressive bear-like man the way kings were in my mother's fairy tales. He was too short and too oily, and also a shade too fat to be elegant, but he was shrewd. He routinely doubled his taxes and kept a large army to prevent any rebellion by his citizens. The taxes supported the army, and when the army itself became a threat, he sent it off to fight his neighbors. The victories enriched the treasury. The kingdom of Sunis was bigger than it had been any time since the invaders had broken off pieces of it to reward their allies. The king had driven the Aetolians out of their land on the Sunis side of the Hephaestial Mountains, forcing them back through the narrow pass through the country of Eddis to the Aetolian homeland on the far side. There were rumors that he wanted to annex land out there as well, and that Aetolia was preparing for all-out war. Ignoring his magus, Sunis walked over to the bench on the wall beside my chair. He pulled a small casket off it and carried it to the magus's desk, where he tipped its contents out. A cascade of double heavy gold coins. A single one would buy a family's farm and all its livestock. Several pieces fell and rang on the stone floor. One landed by my foot and lay staring up at me like a yellow eye. I almost bent to pick it up, but stopped myself and said instead, My uncle used to keep that much under his bed and count it every night. Liar, said the king. You never see that much gold before in your life. He couldn't know that I'd overstayed my welcome one night while creeping through his megaron, and had crawled up through the space where the pipes of the Hypocaust ran to hide in his treasure room. I had slept for a day in the stuffy darkness on the ridged tops of his treasure trunks. Sunis tapped the chest, lying empty on its side in front of him. This is the gold that I'm going to offer as a reward if you fail to bring back what I'm sending you for. I'll offer it to anyone from this country or any other who brings you to me. He tipped the casket upright and snapped the lid down. I felt my stomach dropping. It would be hard to outrun a reward like that. I'd be hunted from one end of the world to the other. I'd want you to be alive, of course, said the king, and carefully described the grisly things that would happen to me when I was captured. I tried to stop listening after the first few examples, but he went on, and I was mesmerized like a bird in front of a snake. The Magus stood with his hands across his chest and listened just as carefully. He didn't seem nervous anymore. He must have been satisfied that the king had accepted his plans and that his threats would encourage me in my work. My stomach felt worse and worse. My cell, when I was returned to it, felt warm and safe by comparison to the Magus' study. As soon as the guards were gone, I lay down on my stone bench and dumped the king and his threats out of my head without ceremony. They were too unpleasant to worry over anyway. I concentrated on a vision of myself leaving the prison. I made myself as comfortable as possible and went to sleep. We're at 20 minutes and I'm going to read another chapter, so yeah, we're doing it. Chapter 2. 2 guards came for me late the next morning and I was surprised again. I thought that the traveling the Magus had mentioned would take some time to plan for. He'd clearly gotten the king's approval for the plan only the previous night. My hopes, which had been falling and rising, sank again as I realized that the Magus hadn't mentioned how far we would travel. It might be no more than a few miles. But I cheered up once I was free of my chains. The guards removed the manacles this time as well as the waist and ankle cuffs. There were no clanking noises to accompany us as we walked down the gallery past the row of cell doors to the guard room. The only sound was the tramp of feet, the guards, not mine, and the creaking of leather jackets that they wore under their steel breastplates. Excuse me. We crossed through the guard room to the door to the courtyard between the prison and the Megaron. When the door opened, I learned in an instant that the light of the lamps the night before had been nothing to compare with the sun itself. It was nearly noon, and the sunlight dropped directly into the courtyard. The pale yellow of the stones in the walls reflected it from all sides. I howled and swore as I covered my head with my arms and hunched over in pain. Burning at the stake couldn't have been worse. It's a funny thing that the new gods have been worshipped in Sunas since the invaders came, but when people need a truly satisfying curse, they call on the old gods. I called on all of them, one right after another, and used every curse I'd overheard in the lower city. Gods damn! I was howling as the guards led me, completely blind, down the stairs. I still had my hands over my eyes, and they held me firmly by the elbows. My feet hardly touched the stone steps. At the bottom, the Magus was waiting. He told me to pull myself together. Gods damn you too, I said through my hands. One of the guards gave me a brisk shake, and I almost cursed him as well, but decided to concentrate on the pain in my eyes. It didn't fade much, but after a few minutes, when I tilted my hands a little away from my face and looked down, I could make out the flagstones through my tears. I sniffed a little and wiped the tears away. As soon as I could manage, I pulled my hands farther from my face and tried to see what was happening around me in the courtyard. I had plenty of time. There was an incredible amount of noise as horses crashed back and forth across the flagstones and the Magus shouted at people. Not far away, someone was unpacking a brace of saddlebags and scattering the contents of the feet of a nervous horse. The horse kept sidling away from the mess and was dragged back by the groom holding its head. Evidently something was missing from the saddlebags. With more swearing, the Magus sent the unpacker back to the castle to fetch whatever it was. Look for it on the bench next to the retort, shouted the Magus at the disappearing figure. That's where it was when I told you to pack it the first time. Idiot, he muttered under his breath. By the time the idiot returned, I could see that he was carrying a small square leather case, which he dropped into a saddlebag. He then shoveled the waiting piles back on top of it. The noise in the courtyard diminished as the Magus stopped shouting and the horses calmed down. I was still looking at the world through my tears and the narrowest of slits between my eyelids. I counted the hazy shapes in front of me. It didn't seem like a large party, only 5 horses, but all of them had humped baggage behind their saddles. It was going to be a long trip. I grinned with satisfaction. Beside me, the Magus looked up at the sky and said to no one in particular, I'd planned to leave at daybreak. Paul, he shouted, get the boys mounted, I'll load the thief. I didn't appreciate the way he spoke of me as another parcel to be dumped into a saddlebag, or, in my case, a saddle. He walked over to a horse, and I could see that he gestured to me to join him, but I didn't move. I hate horses. I know people who think that they are noble, graceful animals, but regardless of what a horse looks like from a distance, never forget that it is as likely to step on your foot as look at you. What? I dissembled. Get on the horse, you idiot. Me? Of course you fool. I didn't move, and the Magus got tired of waiting. He stepped to my side, grabbed me by the back of my neck, and hauled me over to the horse. I set my heels in and resisted. If I was going to climb into an animal 8 times my size, I wanted to plan the attempt first. The Magus was a good bit stronger than I was. Holding me by the cloth at the back of my neck, he shook once or twice, and my head swam. I heard cheap cloth tear. He grabbed for a firmer grip on my neck. Put your left foot in the stirrup, he said. "Your left one." I did as I was told, and 2 of the grooms stepped over to lever me into the saddle before my brains had settled. Once up, I shook the hair back out of my eyes. As I tried to get it to hook behind my ears, I looked around. Being 6 feet off the ground does give one a sense of superiority. I shrugged my shoulders and crossed my arms, but the animal underneath me lurched sideways, and I had to uncross them in order to snatch at the front of the saddle. I held on while I waited for the others to mount. Once the others were up, the magus directed his mount toward the archway at one side of the courtyard. My horse obediently followed, and the others came behind me as we passed under rooms of the palace and hallways that I had been in the night before. My eyes had a few moments of relief before we reached the outer gate. There was no fanfare, no shouting crowds to wish us luck on our journey. Just as well. The only time I had been the focus of shouting crowds had been my trial, and I hadn't enjoyed that at all. We weren't leaving through the main gate of the Megaron, so we emptied into a narrow street, only a little wider than the horses. My feet brushed against the whitewashed walls on either side. We twisted through more narrow streets until we reached the Sacred Way, which we followed down the gate out of the old city. The gate was made out of blocks of stone bigger across than I am tall, something else supposedly built by the old gods, and it was topped by a solid stone lintel with 2 carved lions that were supposed to roar if an enemy of the king passed beneath them. At least they were said to be lions. The stone had been weathered by the centuries, and only indistinct monster figures remained, facing each other over a short pillar. They remained silent as we passed under. The king's route was wide and straight, crossing the more circuitous Sacred Way twice again before reaching the docks. When first built, the route had been bordered by stone walls that defended this road that connected the city to its harbor and its ships. The long walls were later dismantled to provide building materials for each new wing of the king's Megaron as it grew from a 1-room stronghold to a 4-story palace. As we rode onto the avenue, the sound of our horses' hooves was muddled with the other noises of the city. It was just before midday, and we were in the middle of the last surge of activity before people withdrew into their homes to wait out the afternoon heat. There were a few other horses on the road, and many more donkeys. People traveled on foot and in sedan chairs carried by servants. Merchants brought their goods up the avenue in carts and then led loaded donkeys down the narrow alleys to the back doors of the great houses, hoping to sell their vegetables to the cook, their linen to the housekeeper, or their wine to the steward. There was jostling and shouting and noise, and I relished it after the perpetual smothered quiet of the prison. We threaded our way through traffic, drawing curious looks. My companions were dressed in sturdy traveling clothes. I was still in the clothes that I had worn to prison. My tunic had started life a cheerful yellow that I'd thought was dashing when I'd gotten it from a merchant in the lower city. It had faded to a greasy beige color. In addition to the smaller tears in the elbows, it had a larger one across my shoulders, thanks to the ministrations of the king's magus. I wondered what he thought I was going to wear if he persisted in shredding my clothes. We crossed the upper part of the Sacred Way, then the lower part, which held all the nicest shops in the city. Looking up and down it from in the intersection, I could see the sedan chairs and fancy carriages waiting by doorways while the gently bred owners made their purchases inside. One shop near the corner sold only earrings, and I watched it wistfully as it went by. We were too far away, and there was too much traffic to allow even a glimpse of the merchandise displayed in its window. Once we got to the lower town, traffic thinned out as people retreated indoors. I looked in vain for a familiar face. I wanted to tell someone I knew that I was free, but I didn't know very many people who'd be out on the street in the middle of the day. When we reached the docks, we turned and rode along beside them down toward the north gate out of the city. We passed the merchant ships and a pier full of private boats for fishing and pleasure, and then the king's warships lined up at their docks. I was counting the cannons bolted to their decks, and I almost didn't see Philonikes passing by me. "Philonikes!" I yelled, leaning out of the saddle. "Hey, Philonikes!" It was as much as I said before the magus grabbed my arm and dragged me away. He kicked his horse into a trot, and mine as well, as he hauled me down the street. I turned backward to wave to Philonikes, disappearing around a corner, but I am not sure he recognized me. The magus turned around another corner before we slowed down, the other 4 riders hurrying to catch up. "Damn it," said the magus. "What do you think you're doing?" I pointed backwards and looked bewildered. Well, if he was a friend of mine, I was going to say hello. "Do you think I want everyone in the city to know that you're out working for the king?" "Well, why not?" "Do you know it's off you're going to steal something before you start?" He thought for a second. "I guess you do." Well, I don't." "Well, why not?" I asked again. "None of your business. Just keep your mouth shut, do you understand?" "Sure," I shrugged. The knot we made of horses and riders in the middle of the street broke up as we restarted our journey. I ducked my head to hide my smile as my horse clopped along after the magus's. At the south gate, we went once again through a cool tunnel, this one much longer than the one through the Megaron. It passed under the sloping earthwork and newer city wall. Then we were out in the sunshine again. Not that the city ended at the walls. The invaders, in their officious and sensible way, had brought prosperity to the city, and it never stopped growing larger than its boundaries. We rode past the fine houses of the merchants who chose not to live squeezed into the city. Over the tops of garden walls we could see the citrus, the fig, and the almond trees shading the grass or the edge of a veranda. The horses provided a sort of moving platform, allowing glimpses into other people's privacy. I would have preferred to climb the walls and look my fill. I didn't like the way the view kept disappearing behind dark green leaves of an orange tree just as I got interested. Beyond the villas, the farms began. The fields stretched perfectly flat on either side of us for miles in every direction. There was not even an undulation in the ground, it seemed, until the road that reached the foothills of the Hephaestal Mountains, many miles ahead of us. Somewhere on our right, between us and the sea, should have been the river Sapertia, but I couldn't see it, even from the back of a horse. I stood up in my stirrups to look, but I could only guess that the water was hidden behind a line of trees that grew along its banks. My knees began to quiver after only a moment, so I sat down again. The horse made a little huffing noise of complaint. "Don't pull on the reins," the man on my right said. I looked down at the pieces of leather held in my hands and dropped them all together. The animal obviously knew where it was going without guidance. We passed field after field of onions and an occasional smaller field of cucumber or watermelon. The watermelons were as big as my head, so it was later in the summer than I thought. I'd taken a long time to get out of prison. We rode on through the heat. The late summer winds, the Etesians, hadn't come yet, and nothing moved in the entire landscape. The sun beat down, and even the dust didn't try to rise. We passed a grove of olive trees set out in front of a farmhouse. The silver-green leaves could have been carved out of stone. In the city, I'd wanted to hug the sunlight and wrap it around myself like a blanket. I'd turned my body in the saddle in order to expose as much of my skin as possible to direct light. It was pleasant at first, but by the time the city was a single lump of gold stone behind us, I felt as if I were wearing a coat of dirt and dried sweat that had shrunk to be 2 sizes too small. I itched everywhere. The smells of the prison floated down the road with me, and I think that even the horse underneath me objected. I noticed that as the sun got hotter, the 2 riders on either side of me moved farther and farther away. I looked over the party. The magus I had already studied. On my right was the soldier who'd warned me about pulling on the reins. His profession was obvious, as was the sword tucked under the flap of one of his saddlebags. I guessed that he was the Pole that Magus had shouted to in the courtyard, because the other 2 members of the group were certainly the boys. One younger and one several years older, I guessed, and then myself. And why they were with us I couldn't imagine. The older one also had a sword in a scabbard, and with coaching he could probably chop up a straw man, but the younger one looked to be completely useless. They were both obviously well-bred, not servants, and I wondered if they were brothers. Like the magus, they were dressed in dark blue tunics that flared at the waist over their trousers. The older one had darker hair and was the better looking. He looked as if he knew it. Riding on my left, he wrinkled his nose whenever a small wind wafted from my direction, but he never looked over at me. The younger boy rode mostly behind me, and every time I turned my head to glance at him, I found him staring back. I identified them as Useless the elder and Useless the younger for the time being. The heat grew intolerable, and I grew more exhausted with every lurch of the horse I was riding. After what seemed like hours of swaying in the saddle, I realized that a fall was inevitable if we didn't stop. "I'm tired," I said. I'm tired." There was no response. The magus didn't even turn his head, so I made a decision for myself. I slid sideways down one side of the horse, trusting that the leg I left behind would come after me. It did, though not gracefully. The horse was still moving as I reached the ground, and I had to hop a few steps on one leg until my other leg caught up. Once I had both feet planted in the dust of the road, I headed for the grass beside it. I stepped into a ditch and, coming out of it, stumbled onto my knees and then onto my stomach, and didn't get up. The soldier must have come after me like a shot. I felt his fingers grab for my shirt as I fell. Everyone else dismounted and trooped across to the ditch as well, until they were standing around me in a half circle. I opened my eyes for a moment to look at their boots, then closed them again. "What's the matter with him, magus?" It must have been the younger one that asked. Sorry. "God's damn, we're only halfway to Methana, and I wanted to get to matinee tonight. He's exhausted, that's all. Not enough food to keep him going. No, just leave him," as someone prodded me with a boot. Oh, thank gods, I thought. They're going to leave me. All I wanted to do was lie in the dry, prickly grass with my feet in a ditch forever. It would be a convenient sort of mile marker, I thought. Get to the thief, and you know you're halfway to Methana, whatever Methana might be. But they didn't leave me. They unsaddled their horses and got out their lunches and sat and ate while I slept. When the sun was halfway down the sky, Pole nudged me with one foot until I woke up. I twitched with my eyes open and had no idea at all where I was. I wasn't in bed. I wasn't at home. I'd woken up several times disoriented in the prison, and I automatically stifled my first thrash of surprise to prevent my chains from grinding on old bruises, and finally remembered that there were no chains. I crossed one arm over my face and moaned convincingly. I felt surprisingly well. I was hungry as a donkey, but my head was clear. I sat up and rubbed at the stiffness on the side of my face where the grass had left its rough pattern. I groaned and complained while Pole, single-handed, pushed me back up onto the horse, and we all started down the road again. The Magus rode beside me and handed me pieces of cheese and lumps of bread that he tore off a loaf as we went. I ate with one hand and held on with another. Horses are the most awful means of transport. I wanted to ask why they hadn't thought to bring a cart, but I was too busy eating. We made it to Mathena as the sun was going down. It was a small town with just a few houses and an inn at an intersection of roads. We didn't stop. We rode on until it was pitch dark. The moon was just a tiny sickle, and the soldier dismounted to lead his horse. He walked slowly to avoid stepping into the ditch by the roadside, and the other horses followed us. The night air was cool, but my wonderful nap was a long way behind me. I balanced on the narrow back of my horse and wished the saddle offered more support. My head drooped forward, then bobbed back. The Magus must have had eyes like a thief, because he told Pole to stop and dismounted to walk alongside me, one hand resting just above my knee, ready to shake me if I fell asleep. He shook hard and resorted to pinching periodically. We reached Matinea at last. It was no bigger than Mathena had been, but more roads met there. The inn was 2 stories tall and had a gate beside it that led to an enclosed courtyard. As we rode up, a groomsman came to take the horses. We all slid to the ground, and Pole was quickly beside me with one hand firmly on my shoulder. It was an easy business for him. My shoulder came only to his chest. Sometimes it bothers me that I'm so small. It bothered me then, and I shrugged my shoulder in irritation, but his hand didn't move. The Magus introduced himself as a traveling landholder to the owner of the inn, and said that he had sent a messenger ahead to arrange rooms. The owner was delighted to see him, and we all trooped toward the doorway. As I passed the owner's wife, her nose wrinkled, and as I reached the door, she protested. "That one," she accused, pointing at me. "It's that one that smells so awful. He's not coming into my wine room, and I won't have him sleeping in any of my clean beds." Her husband made futile hushing motions with his hands. "No, I won't have it. Not if he's your lordship's son," she said to the Magus, "although I hope he's not." I could feel my face getting hot as the blood rushed all the way up to my ears. The Magus and the woman negotiated over the husband's protests. The Magus said no, I couldn't sleep in the barn, but I could sleep on the floor. He gave her an extra silver coin and promised I would wash immediately. She gave directions to the pump in the courtyard, and Pole led me away. The pump was in the middle of the courtyard behind the inn. There were stables on 2 sides, a wall on the third, and the back of the inn completed the courtyard. It was not a private place to take a bath. When we reached the pump, Pole grabbed my shirt at the waist and jerked it upward. I snapped my arms down to prevent it from going over my head. The fabric tore in his hands. He reached for me again, but I stepped away, drowsiness gone. "This," I snapped, "I can do for myself." "Just make sure it's a good job," he said, before he began to pump. The water gushed out of the pipe at the height of my waist as I stripped out of my overshirt and dumped it on the cobbles. I pulled off my my shoes. I had no stockings, so the pants followed immediately after. As the water splashed off the cobblestones and onto my naked legs, goose flesh came out under the dirt. I shivered and swore as I bent into the stream. While I rinsed under the pump, the younger Useless arrived. He kept well away from the splattering water. "Put those down on a dry spot," said Pole. "I fetched a couple of sacks from the stable." When Useless came back, Pole took one of the sacks he brought and handed it to me with a square block of soap. Crouching beside the water, I soaked the sack and rubbed the soap across it. It made a tremendous lather, and I stopped to smell it in surprise. I laughed. It was the Magus's scented soap. Useless the younger must have dug it out of one of the saddlebags. I scrubbed myself with the sacking, washing away what felt like years of dirt. I rubbed hard and then rinsed and soaped myself up again before Pole could stop pumping water. I dragged the sack across the back of my neck and as much of my shoulders as I could reach, and scrubbed my face again and again, thinking to myself that my nose would be smaller, but at least it would be clean. The younger Useless stood and watched, and I wondered what he thought of me. The iron waistband left deep bruises in a circle around my waist, and I was covered in flea bites and sores, but the ones on my wrists were the worst. Where the manacles had chafed, there were raw spots partially covered in scabs that were black against my prison fair skin. Once I'd cleaned most of the dirt off myself and rinsed my hair, I squatted down in front of the spraying water and tried to find the place where the water would fall most gently on my wrists. Several of the sores were infected, and they needed to be cleaned out, but that was going to be a painful business. My whole body was shaking with the cold, and I clenched my teeth to stop them from chattering while I leaned into the water. Pole stepped around the pump and leaned over me to look at the sores. The water flow slackened. "Leave him," he said. "I'll work on him inside." He gave me another piece of sacking to dry off with, and when I was done, he handed me a pile of clothes, pants and a shirt, as well as an overshirt and a pair of stout work boots. I looked around for my own clothes and saw the younger Useless disappearing into the stable with them in his arms. "Hey!" I yelled. "Come back with those!" He turned around uncertainly. "May just told me to burn them," he said. "Everything but my shoes." Useless looked into the pile in his arms and wrinkled his nose. "All right, but if May just says to burn them, then you'll have to give them back." "Fine, fine," I said, as I hopped across the wet cobblestones in my bare feet and took my shoes out of his arms. The rest of the clothing I consigned to the fires without regret, but I had the shoes made specially. They were low boots, just a little higher than my ankles, reinforced on the soles, but still supple enough to let me move unsuspected through other people's houses. I carried them back to Pole, then I looked for a dry place to stand while I got dressed. The pants were heavy cotton and bagged at the ankle where they tucked into my shoes. They bagged even more around my waist, but there was a belt to hold them up. The shirt was cotton as well. There's something wonderful about rubbing a clean shirt against clean skin. I was smiling by the time I pulled the overshirt over my head. It was dark blue and short-sleeved. It came down to my thighs and was enough too big that when I moved my arms across my chest it didn't bind. I checked, to be sure. "God's bless that Magus, he thinks of everything, doesn't he?" I said to Pole. He grunted and waved me toward the inn's back door. We went inside the tap room where Magus and the two Uselesses were waiting for us. There were deep bowls of stew set on the table, but before Pole would let me have mine, he wanted to look at my wrists. The Magus looked over his shoulder and then sent the elder Useless up to his room to get a relief kit with bandages and little pots of salve in it. Pole got one of the lanterns off the wall and put it on the table beside him. The landlady tisk-tisked and brought out a bowl of warm water, a cloth, and more soap. Pole started to work on the right wrist first, while I looked at my dinner regretfully. After he had rinsed it with soapy water, he scrubbed a little salve on top of the scabs on the two sores, one above each of the bones in my wrist. Then he wrapped the wrist carefully in a clean white bandage. It was a tidy job, and I was impressed. I was off my guard when he took up my left arm. There was just one sore, but it ran all the way up across the top of my wrist. Instead of a scab, it had raw patches and bubbles of fluid trapped under flaps in the skin. Without any warning, Pole slid a knife under one of the flaps and twisted it open. I screamed at the top of my lungs. Everyone in the room jumped, including Pole, but his knife was as well away from my wrist by then. I struggled to get out of his grip, but he had his hands clamped on my forearm, and he held on like a vice. I tried with my right hand to pry his fingers loose, but they didn't budge. As I went on yelling and twisting his fingers, Pole, without a word, put his knife down on the table and reached into the relief kit. What he brought out was the wooden gag they put in someone's mouth before doing something drastic like cutting off a leg. He held it up in front of my face. "That's enough," he said. I thought about explaining that sore had been there for weeks. I'd been so careful not to let the manacles bang it, and I'd favored it and done everything I could to keep it from hurting anymore, and he could have warned me before he stuck his great God's damned knife into it. But I looked at the gag in his hand and shut my mouth. I contented myself with wiggling and whimpering a little as he opened each of the infected spots, cleaned the entire sore, and rubbed salve on it. When he'd wrapped it in bandage, I sniffed and wiped my nose, and turned to the table to eat my dinner. Useless the elder was looking at me in amusement. "Not exactly stalwart, are you?" he said. I told him what he could do with his own dinner, and got a poke in the rib cage from Pole's elbow. I sulked through the first few bites of my stew before I noticed how good it was. While I savored it, I listened to the others talking, and gathered that the older Useless was named Ambiades, and the younger Sophos. They weren't related to each other, but they were both apprentices of the Magus. I ate until I was too exhausted to keep my head up anymore, and fell asleep on the table with the last bite still in my mouth. We're at 45 minutes. I love you dearly. I hope you're enjoying the book so far. I'll record more soon. I love you. Bye!